All right, welcome everyone, and thanks for coming to this session. I'm Sonya Doucette, and I teach in the science division, and I'm also the climate justice faculty lead for a curriculum project that's been going on at BC, Bellevue College, for about 3 years now. So the main takeaways I hope you leave this session with are that, one, if we're to address the massive problems we're facing, namely the climate crisis, then we have to actively foster hope. Because right now, many people are paralyzed and hopeless, and that prevents us from addressing the problems. And two, we have to confront our emotions around these issues and talk about them, and also take action if we're to foster hope in a way that's sustainable for us as humans, not in the sustainability sense. So these two takeaways are not wishes in the dark about what we should strive for, but instead they're based on evidence from research in these areas. And I'm by no means an expert on hope or emotions. My background and training is in climate science, but there's been a lot of buzz about all this in the climate community, and I'd like to share what I've learned in case it can be helpful or useful to you as you confront or hopefully actively work to address the climate crisis. Because some of these topics are not my area of expertise, I've provided an extensive reference list on the slides at the end of this talk. So if you'd like to learn more, I can make these slides available so that you can explore those references. I do know a lot about climate change from managing this climate justice across the curriculum project at Bellevue College, and climate was also my research focus when I was in graduate school. Before we begin, I'd like to pause and acknowledge that Bellevue College resides on the traditional and occupied land of the coastal Salish peoples, past, present, and future. That includes, but is not limited to, Snoqualmie, Suquamish, Duwamish, Nisqually, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot, Smolcomish, Stakamish, Skopomish, and Upper Puyallup. We honor their connection to the region, pay respect to the Coast Salish elders past and present, and stand in solidarity through their struggles with continued systemic oppression. We commit to care for the land and water and center equity at the core of our unlearning. I'd like to start with a share out using Jamboard, and then we'll move into some background on the importance of hope, emotions, talking and taking action, and then finally some actionable ideas for coping with these massive challenges, especially the climate crisis, and hopefully fostering hope. So to start, it would be great if we could all get a sense of where everyone is at today, who's here, in terms of your thoughts on climate change, climate emotions, mindsets. So I'd like to start with a quick anonymous Jamboard share out for this check-in. So there are going to be two links that I'll drop in the chat in just a minute here. The first is a link to what's called the Sassy Survey, which is 4 quick multiple choice questions that gauge how you feel about climate change. Are you alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive? When you see the results, remember which one you are and enter it on the first Jamboard slide. Then following that slide, there are 3 more slides on Jamboard that have statements for you to fill in the blanks. So let's go to the Jamboard now so that I can show you around. Before we go to the Jamboard, here's a link to the Sassy Survey. If everybody could please click on that link that I just put into the chat, it'll take you to the page that I'm showing on my screen right now. All you have to do here is scroll down and it says take the quiz. And there are 4 very quick questions. When you get to the end of the quiz, it'll tell you which of the 6 Americas you fall into. So this will be on the first slide. Now you can see this Jamboard that I'm showing on my screen right now. Here's the link to that Jamboard. So please click on that second link as well. So you should have the Sassy Survey open, and maybe you've taken it already because it is very short. And then you should have a link to the Jamboard and click on that so that you can access the slides that you see on my screen. So the first slide, you'll enter which of the 6 resulted from your survey. Were you alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive? And to do this, if you've never used Jamboard before, you can go to the left-hand panel and go down to the 4th icon. And when you hover over it, it says sticky note. So click on the sticky note, and then you can type whatever you want here and save it. And you can choose a different color scheme if you would like. So that's the first slide. After you take the Sassy Survey, let us know your results. And this is all anonymous. And then the next 3 slides are fill in the blanks. Slide 2 is a statement that I'd like you to fill in the blank for. It says, when I think about our climate future, I want to. So you'll put a sticky note that has some action you might take. And I want to acknowledge that the questions on slide 2 to 4 were inspired by and adapted from work by Dr. Jennifer Atkinson at UW-Bothell. And I'll say a little bit about her in a moment. The third slide, another fill in the blank. One thing that frightens or angers me about our climate future is, put another sticky note there. And the final slide, slide 4, another fill in the blank. One thing that gives me hope is, so a final sticky note to fill in the blank. So I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes and give you all time to work through these 4 slides. And then we'll reconvene the session. And you'll be able to see what everybody else is responding to on these slides. So this whole process that we're doing here gives you a chance to say how you are feeling about things and see how others are feeling about things. So this is the beginnings of a climate conversation, and you'll see why this is so important as we move through this session today.
I have a question. I click on the second link is Jamboard, but then what else should I do? It says quiz, but I cannot go the place where you are. Or should I click take the quiz?
Yes, to this link, you click take the quiz. So
Okay.
when you click America survey, whoops. It didn't go back to where I thought it would, but let me show you on my screen here. It's still loading. Yes, so can you see my screen?
Yes, I click already. Yes, I saw that one. And then let me go to the next.
Yeah, you scroll down and hit take the quiz, and it'll be 4 questions. You just hit next, and then it'll do which of these 6 you are.
Okay, thank you.
Looks like there are 10 of you here in addition to the host and I. So I'm going to give about another minute for folks to put a sticky note on these slides.
It's me again. I'm sorry, I have an old computer. I did the quiz, and where can I go to the sticky notes to this page?
Yeah, to this Jamboard. So I'll put the link in the chat again, just so you have it as the last thing that was, there we go.
Okay.
So in the chat, that last thing that was entered is a link to this Jamboard, and it should take you here. You should see exactly what you're seeing on my screen.
And I got it, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so please continue to give your feedback on the slides, and I'm going to move on. So based on what we saw on the Jamboard slides, many of you who are alarmed are not alone. The number of people concerned and alarmed about climate change has greatly increased over the last decade. So what you see on this graph are concerned being the green ball and alarmed being the blue ball. And the blue one, the alarmed ball, if you watch it now, it starts in the bottom group, but then it shoots up beginning in about 2015 and then almost doubles by 2020. So what we saw in our results are aligned with what's happening in the world. And this survey is put out by the Yale Program on Climate Communication, and they've been doing these surveys since 2010. You can see the x-axis on this slide. And attitudes are changing as we're starting to see climate events happening more and more around the world. Next, some background information. But before we start this part, I want to acknowledge that for the rest of this talk, I rely very heavily on the work of 2 people. One is Dr. Ellen Kelsey, who's a scholar at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. I used a lot of the information that I'm presenting here that comes from her book called Hope Matters. And I also rely on the work of Dr. Jennifer Atkinson, who is at the University of Washington, Bothell. I present information from her Facing It podcast. So because I'm not an expert in hope or emotions, and talking about climate, I've relied very heavily on their work and have even used their exact phrasing in many cases so that I didn't lose the meaning of what they intended to convey. Any hope concerning the future of the climate is delusional. So statements like this that express strong feelings of hopelessness are widespread when it comes to climate change. And there's growing evidence appearing in the academic literature of the disciplines who study this, that children and adults alike are feeling hopeless about the future. The terms and phrases shown on this slide here are being used more and more to name the range of feelings that we have in response to how we perceive the state of the world. A very readable book called Hope Matters came out very recently. It's by Ellen Kelsey, that professor from University of Victoria in British Columbia that I mentioned. And she studies hope as it relates to addressing climate change and other environmental crises. So in her book, she argues that hope is not only warranted, but essential to addressing these issues. And she thinks this is because we are constantly inundated with bad news about the climate. And as a result, we feel hopeless. She calls this a crisis of hope. Almost everything we hear and learn about climate and the way we talk to each other and teach and learn about climate is in a problem identification orientation. What that means is that only the problems are presented, and often in a horrifying way. Looking at climate change as an endless series of problems to solve has been taken for granted. It's become the taken for granted norm. This begins with the way researchers present information about climate change in academic journals and flows into the narratives and stories of disasters and corruption and scandal that we hear about in the media. This also makes its way into our textbooks, where only a small percentage of the books actually focus on solutions. Most of the information in textbooks is about describing the problem. And there are major consequences to this societal doom and gloom orientation. The collateral damage of doom and gloom is that people feel paralyzed and they don't feel they can engage or that they have any entry point into doing something about the problem, especially beyond their own individual actions. And this is a problem because what we really need is rapid and massive systemic change beyond the changes made within our own lives and within our own households. The doom and gloom orientation inspires hopelessness, and hopelessness has strong connections to cynicism and apathy. We've also seen a rise in cynicism and a lack of trust in each other and our institutions. The hopelessness and the cynicism and apathy and the distrust has grown fastest among young people, putting them in a horrible position to address the challenges they face in their lives, or they will face in their lives. Youth are even questioning what purpose there is in working hard in school for a future that may never come to pass. These youth are known as the climate generation because they are the first to spend their entire lives with the effects of climate change present. This generation cares greatly about climate change and social justice, and they see a clear link between the two. They feel financially insecure. This is the first generation more likely to be less well off than their parents. These youth are troubled by the increasing disparity between rich and poor. They were raised with smartphones, social media, and unprecedented internet access to global networks and information. But despite all this, they're more lonely and depressed than previous generations. Before they reach college, 66 to 85% experience some sort of trauma in the form of sexual assault, violence, loss of a loved one, or being bullied. They are the most ethnically diverse generation in US history. and they're the most stressed, although they're the least likely to vote. The study I'll use as a case study to illustrate the psychological distress of the climate crisis on all of us is focused on youth because they are experiencing the worst of it. This study is one of many looking at the impacts of climate anxiety on young people. It's one of the bigger ones. It surveyed 10,000 youth ages 16 to 25 from around the world about their attitudes, feelings, and thoughts on climate change. The result the researchers found were devastating in terms of how climate anxiety impacts their daily functioning, and also how it disproportionately affects Black and Indigenous youth and other youth of color from the global South. Clearly, climate anxiety is an equity issue on a global scale. These are some of the main findings of the study. 2/3 of youth feel sad, afraid, and anxious. 50% are angry, powerless, helpless, guilty, ashamed. 8 out of 10 feel people have failed to take care of the planet and that the future is frightening. 50% believe humanity is doomed. 4 out of 10 are reluctant to have children. And 45% say climate anxiety is impacting their daily lives and their ability to function. All of that emotional distress is concentrated more heavily in poorer countries of the global South, the red countries on this image. And these countries have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions that are heating up the planet, but they're feeling the effects of climate change most intensely, while at the same time having less resources to deal with these effects. For example, 92% of youth surveyed in the Philippines felt that the future is frightening, compared with 68% in the US. Some suggest that the distress is so psychologically damaging that it should be considered a violation of human rights. This idea is reflected in 2 quotes from youth living in the global South. This is a quote from Mitzi Ton, a climate activist from the Philippines. "I grew up being afraid of drowning in my own bedroom. Society tells me that this anxiety is an irrational fear that needs to be overcome, one that meditation and healthy coping mechanisms will fix. At its root, our climate anxiety comes from this deep-set feeling of betrayal because of government inaction. To truly address our growing climate anxiety, we need justice." Jaera Beg grew up in the Hunza Valley of Pakistan, which is very affected by increasingly intense flooding and monsoon rains. And she said, "I have witnessed people suffering and dying since I was a child. I'm angry about it. I'm sad about it. I don't know how people have the audacity to prioritize money over humanity. I should be in university, but I have no choice." The study found that the biggest source of psychological distress in young people is government inaction. 2/3 of youth surveyed believe governments are lying about the effectiveness of their actions, and they feel betrayed and abandoned by their government. You can see this sort of thing playing out in real-time interactions, like the one between American youth and Senator Feinstein in the video that went viral in early 2019. Many youth feel this way. Youth climate activist Aji Piper's quote illustrates this finding. "Our federal government has not been held accountable for their gross failure to protect the life and the future life on this earth, forcing us children to take drastic actions to procure the needed motivation in order to save life on this planet." The founder of the Sunrise Movement, a youth movement, Varshini Prakash, said, "Fighting climate change is about survival and existence. Are we going to take action over the next 10 years to ensure our generation has a livable future? Or are we going to continue to kick the can down the road and resign ourselves to a life filled with chaos, violence, and uncertainty?" The study found that long-term impacts on youth are relational. Youth struggle with trust and relationships because they feel they cannot talk about climate change. When they do, their concerns are being ignored or dismissed. When youth are not listened to, they don't feel part of the world. And feeling that their needs and future needs are not being given attention. Youth no longer believe and trust what adults say to them. They lack motivation toward pursuing an education. The researchers reported students making comments like this one. What's the point in going to school? What's the point in taking exams? Because I'm not going to have a future. This is how youth are feeling, but many of us who are not youth are feeling it too. So what do? How do we cope and find hope for ourselves, for our colleagues, for our students, for our communities, so we can address the massive challenges we face? Before I start this part, I want to again acknowledge my heavy reliance on the work of Dr. Jennifer Atkinson from the University of Washington Bothell campus, especially episode 4 of her podcast. I've adapted the 4 steps to coping with climate despair that she lays out in this episode and merged them with ideas by Ellen Kelsey. I wanted to pause to make this acknowledgement again because I use exact phrases and sentences from Dr. Atkinson's podcast in places because her words are very powerful. Often the first step in coping with climate anxiety is to acknowledge it instead of denying it. With climate change, this is not only personal denial, like the temporary shock we experience after losing a loved one, but public denial. And it's really about straight up socially constructed mass delusion. So there are many studies illustrating how this collective denial works. One is the famous Columbia University experiment. It's called the smoke-filled room study, where people were given a questionnaire to fill out, and then partway through the process, the room begins filling with smoke. So let me play this video, and I'm going to do it in double time, so it doesn't take a lot of time. With this study, if a person was alone in the room and the room started filling with smoke, they quickly left the room and reported the issue. But if they were in a group, something different happened. So let's just watch. Smoke's filling the room. She's looking around, wondering why no one else is doing anything. So if no one else responded, they too would keep taking the survey, sometimes long enough so that the smoke started to make people cough. The root of our mass delusion and collective denial around climate comes from the fact that, like the participants in this study, no one wants to be seen as alarmist or going against the status quo when others are calmly proceeding with business as usual. And then there are also more personal reasons that we avoid acknowledging the scale of this crisis. Many of us worry that if we directly confront our fear and grief and anger, we'll fall into a bottomless pit of despair and never climb back out. But the opposite is true. And research shows that many people quickly move on to solutions and actions once they acknowledge unpleasant facts. That's partly because they stopped investing their energy in suppressing and denying and deflecting the problem. The second step in combating climate anxiety is to talk about it. As the old saying in neuroscience goes, if you can name it, you can tame it. We often think that people fail to act on climate because they don't care or don't know enough about the problem, but that's not true. The problem is that we live in a culture of climate silence, which leads people to bottle up fear and concern. If you don't believe me, try getting others to talk about climate the next time you're on a bus or buying coffee. Climate communication expert George Marshall has been testing this for years, and here's what he found. The words sink and die in midair, and the conversation suddenly changes course. This is hard to describe, but anyone who tries it knows exactly what I mean. It is like an invisible force field that you only discover when you barge right into it. Few people ever do, because without ever having been told, they have somehow learned that this topic is out of bounds. Not talking about climate is a big problem because we're social creatures, and evidence-based psychology shows that having conversations and social interactions are the driving force for behavior change. The other reason for talking about climate anxiety is that it makes people feel less alone. Depression and anxiety come from feeling isolated. And when people feel alone, they aren't empowered to act. But this is easy to reverse by simply talking about it. Dr. Atkinson found that talking about climate emotions is the single most helpful element of her course for students. Being in the same room with others, talking about the same distress and feeling heard. She teaches a course called Eco-Anxiety and Climate Grief at the University of Washington, Bothell. The third step to take action is to take action. We often assume that people need to feel hope before they'll act, but that thinking is backwards. It's action that gives rise to hope, not the other way around. The philosopher Joanna Macy calls this active hope. It's a practice like gardening or tennis, something you do rather than something you have. No one ever feels worse after joining a volunteer project or a protest or some other community effort. That's because action moves us from spectators to feeling empowered and connected to others that are part of a movement that's greater than any individual. Then there's the question of who should act, because the people bearing the burden of climate change are dying as they try to save themselves. 2020 was the deadliest year for activists, and all deaths globally, except for one person in Canada, occurred in countries of the global south. And 37% of these deaths were Indigenous people, even though they only make up 6% of the global population. When you take action, find others to take action with, to build a mass movement that will actually make a difference. David Lammy, an English Labour Party politician, describes the air pollution in the London neighborhood where he grew up due to gas burning vehicles on a nearby freeway. This caused severe asthma in many people of color living in his neighborhood, making it difficult for them to breathe. Decades later, this is still happening. Last year, a 9-year-old girl, also from a London neighborhood, died from severe asthma. And this was directly tied to air pollution. So taking action together can help us be stronger together. The fourth and final way to combat climate anxiety is to seek out and share positive stories of change and transformation. They're out there, we just don't see them easily because the mainstream media focuses 85% of its coverage on bad news. Seeking out positive stories and providing each other with a steady stream of good news is a critical aspect of fostering hope. It also helps us come up with new stories about our future that can become a new reality. In his recent book, The Future Earth, Eric Holthaus does just that. He tells positive, plausible stories about our climate future. And positive stories work because hope is a social construct based on mindset. Positive stories about the future are like the placebo pills taken during medical trials that give rise to the placebo effect. This is where we believe we're taking a real medication that will help, but we're actually not, but then we actually see positive physical changes in our body, like a decrease in blood pressure, for example. It's the same with positive stories and hope, except that the stories are the pill and the hope is the physical change. Kelsey argues that the positive mindset that results from seeking positive stories literally changes reality. So hope in this sense lies in the capacity of stories to transform mindsets and then ultimately reality. To wrap things up, exactly what people mean by hope is hotly debated and has many meanings depending on who you ask. And of all the definitions I've come across, I like this one best. Hope is like a road in the country. There never was a road, but when many people walk on it, the road comes into existence. This quote describes hope that is active and collective and points to hope as a thing we do together. And when social transformation is the goal, this is what we need. I'm hoping that we can now pause and can continue this session today in a conversation that involves sharing our ideas with each other about how we can bring safe spaces to share emotions, safe spaces for conversation, opportunities for action, and examples of positive emerging trends into our daily interactions to engage with each other in empowering transformative change around climate. So there are a decent number of us here. There are about 10 or 11. So what I'd like to do is go into breakout rooms. Alyssa, we have another 25 minutes, right?
The session ends at 1:20, but we can go over just based on the class schedule. Sorry, Sonya.
Oh, no, that's okay. That's totally fine. This was meant for an even shorter session than an hour anyway. So why don't we try not going into breakouts then and see how it goes. If maybe we can just share ideas by typing your thoughts in the chat or just unmute yourself to speak if you're okay with doing that. And hopefully in the last 7 minutes here, we can throw out a few ideas and wrap up the session that way. So I'll just pause and give folks a chance to speak or a chance to type things into the chat. And I was recording that talk because I want to provide it more widely, but I'm going to stop recording right now so that people feel comfortable sharing.